So let's talk through some gold and shield hosts, with a look at some top performing Adeptus Custodes army lists, what units are getting played and why. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Custodes, and in this video I thought we'd talk through some strong army lists for the faction. Custodes seem to have had a bit of a wild ride in 10th edition so far. They're basically ping-ponged from being one of the strongest armies in the game to one of the weakest repeatedly. Different balance passes changing things really quite radically for them, then their codex came out which reset them to being very weak again. Then they got a bit more help from the Pariah Nexus update, having the faction settle at a win rate of around about 48% in tournaments. Kind of mid-tier in Warhammer 40k from that perspective, but as ever they certainly seem to be a faction that do far better in more casual metas than a hyper-competitive one, and particularly seem kind of unlikely to reach the top tables of grand tournaments. That's often the case with sort of stat check armies with a low skill ceiling, just a little bit less scope for clever tricks than some of the factions out there. In any case though, it's still nice to see the Golden Legion neither being overpowered nor too weak currently, and they have still managed a couple of big tournament wins since their codex dropped. Their competitive play rate is kind of middling-ish, around about 12th out of 26 factions in big grand tournaments, maybe a tiny bit on the low side for them as they're quite a widely collected army, having very low barriers of entry in terms of money and model access. For their army lists that are doing well, their builds do tend to be a bit convergent. Shield Host seems to be near universally agreed as the best detachment right now. Almost everyone seems to be playing that on the competitive scene, getting a useful damage buff each turn rather than just once per game, and shield captains no longer being locked to battle tactics only was quite a big win for that one, making a lot more of the stratagems just a bit better with some characters. Otherwise, Talons of the Emperor is the next most played, though far less than Shield Host. Doesn't seem to be doing too badly in tournaments though, and weirdly enough, one of the only tournament wins that they have had was with Normaiden Task Force as well. Very rarely played, but shows that it can have at least some legs with one great player. In any case though, let's take a look at a few army lists and the choices that people are making. First up, we'll start with the other grand tournament win that Custodians have had since their codex, and this one was posted by Yizeng Shen, who used it to take first at the Shanghai Sanlin Championship, an event over in China, going 5-0 against a 48-player tournament. As with most competitive Custodians lists, it was Shield Host being used, so basically all the units getting better in melee each turn, either getting army-wide extra AP or critical hits on a 5+, which matters with the Martial Guitar when you get either sustained or lethal hits. This list is built around 4 blocks of 4 Custodians, 2 sets of 4 Custodian Guard, 3 with Spears and 1 with Vexilla and Shield, and then 2 sets of 4 Wardens largely with Spears. Custodians with Guardian Spears tend to be the mainstay of most armies, having their standard chunky defensive stats, and then enough quality Guardian Spear melee can deal with most things out there, particularly between the Martial Guitar and the Shield Host buffs. To lead those, there's 2 Blade Champions. My guess would be that at least one of those would go with the Wardens, maybe both of them, delivering them to combat nice and fast and giving them a bit more bite with a damage 3 profile. One of them takes the Panoptic specs for ignores cover. One of the squads of Custodian Guard would be led by Kyria Draxus, the Inquisitor with a massive amount of shooting, and is still good despite a points increase from Imperial agents. The Custodian Guard squad can give her 4 rerolls to wound and double shooting her weapons, which is kind of big, plus also potentially using a shooting damage buff stratagem if they want to. Then we've got a Terminator Shield Captain with the From the Hall of Armourers enhancements to give him a scary strength 8 and damage 3 Guardian Spear, so quite a handful there. I guess he's probably going to be leading the set of 2 Allarus Custodians with Spears, the first turn teleporting Terminators if you want them to, and then he could give them free stratagems. I feel like it still wouldn't be the most crazy idea ever to run him solo though. If he was with them though, it'd certainly pack a hell of a punch against heavy monsters and vehicles. Otherwise, there's 2 cheap units of Sisters Prosecutors, small units to do actions, 1 unit of Witch Seekers with a slightly boosted damage with their Flamers and their Scout move, and Anathema Psychana Rhino to transport some of those. I'd guess maybe scouting with the Witch Seekers perhaps. I guess that made them a fairly cheap and annoying nuisance unit to do objective type things. A Caladius Assassin to bounce on and off the board doing secondaries, and then a couple of very scary rapid ingress threats in 2 squads of Venatari, the jump pack Custodians that got a big points guts down to 165 points, and then have Lance keyword Guardian Spears that hit really hard. Overall certainly looks like a pretty solid list for the Custodes. I feel like maybe taking that Anathema Psychana Rhino is the most interesting choice compared with other lists out there. I guess it's pretty cheap and pretty tough and super low priority. It will make it a good nuisance unit when really you want all of your heavy firepower going into golden armor to try and deal with them. In any case, very cool to see someone take down a tournament with Custodes. It hasn't happened a lot since their codex. To focus on a few of their choices, I thought it was maybe just worth showing the things that the shield host can do. This one was the one that was errated, so each turn you either get to pick critical hits of a 5+ in melee, or boost everything with a martial Qatar by AP-1 in melee. They're both powerful. I'd probably say the critical hits one is maybe the default one. You might just be more tempted by the extra AP if you're going into something that's got really high saves, like say maybe lots of Space Marines that had very high saves, or access to Armour of Contempt. The critical hits on 5s is pretty nice for taking down tough stuff though. Getting lethal hits on 5s or 6s and bypassing the wound roll is pretty devastating with Guardian Spears. Otherwise, for support, they've got a bunch of stratagems. I'd say most of them don't really tend to be standout value for the command point cost, but are all really usable in the right situation, and lots of them pretty good for Guardian Spear squads scrapping over the midboard. There's a 4-back shoot and charge, a -1 to hit in melee if you're on an objective, a 4+ save against mortal wounds, either sustained or lethal hits with their shooting attacks, which could be fun with Kyria Draxus I guess, a sticky objectives one, and a plus attacks damage buff for depleted units. For the enhancements, that Panoptispect is pretty nice to sink 5 points into. 5 points for Ignore's cover does actually make Guardian Spears a lot more threatening at range, and the +1 strength and damage one is pretty standout for a shield captain in melee. Getting a damage 3 profile in there is pretty good. Beyond that, they have a redeploy 2 units one and an Auric Mantle for 2 wounds extra on a profile, but they get played a bit less, particularly given the changes to the redeploy things in Pariah Nexus. Otherwise, here's a quick look at some of the core of the army. I'd perhaps say that people tend to use Wardens a little bit more than the Custodian Guard. I feel like they're kind of two sides of the same coin and fairly well balanced though. Custodian Guard are a bit more on damage focus mode, a little bit cheaper at 45 points each, usually taking the Guardian Spears unless you want to swap one out for a Vexilla. They get to reroll wound rolls of 1 innately, and if you're in range of an objective marker that you control, the full reroll wounds thing is pretty massive. They also get to double shoot once per game. As mentioned, that's great with Kyria Draxus. Otherwise, Wardens are the tanky version, a -1 to wound if they've got a character leading the unit. For the Vexilla, you don't have to swap out their Guardian Spear, which is a nice plus, so that basically makes it auto-include. And once per game they get their massive turn of tankiness, being able to have a single phase of 4+ feel no pain. And that can be very nice after the squad's committed to the fight and they're in a good position, just make them ridiculously hard to kill between that and the -1 to wound. They're perhaps the unit that does the whole Custodians tactic of just stepping into the midfield and not dying there better than any. Moving on to the second list, and another high placing one was this one by Matt Bell, who used it to take third at Brewhammer GT. Another shield host, but of a slightly different flavour. This one's really going heavy on the Blade Champions and Wardens units, basically 3 big blocks of Wardens, 2 of them with 5 strong models, each of them headed up by one of those fighty Blade Champions, nice damage profiles and advance and charge once per game. Again, there's 2 units of those Rapid Ingress Venatari with the Lances for the +1 to wound when they charge in. For the objectives, again, there's a Caladius Assassin, and then 1 unit of Prosecutors and Witch Seekers for actions and objectives. And this one chooses to take some serious firepower in a couple of Caladius Grav tanks, equipped with the Twin Arachnus heavy blaze cannons and a massive threat to enemy armour at range. This one feels very focused indeed, deciding that Wardens and Blade Champions are what you want for your battle line, a couple of massive rapid ingress threats, scary firepower and objective support. Just seems to be going with a very clear strategy and sticking to it. For the Forge World range, it really seems to be the Caladius and the Venatari that are the way to go for Custodes currently. The Caladius has 14 wounds at toughness 11 with a 2+ save. I feel like that's a respectable enough stat line for the 215 points that it costs, and most people tend to go with the Twin Arachnus heavy blaze cannons. That's the big hitting anti-tank profile. Those basically get you just 4 super reliable boosted las cannon shots essentially. 4 shots hitting on the Custodes 2+, strength 12 AP3 and damage d6 +2, and also twin linked as well. Between all that, it's a pretty reasonable chance to one-shot most normal-sized battle tanks in the game, and they even get lethal hits against monsters and vehicles as well. Otherwise, it's just got a few anti-infantry style shots with a bolt cannon. I guess in theory, if you're really desperate for every bit of damage, you could use the sustained hits one on them. It probably does feel like a bit of an over-investment, really. In any case though, it seems like they're a bit of a take or leave choice, but certainly do the job if you just do want some dedicated anti-tank shooting for the things that your Guardian Spears can't quite reach. Otherwise for Forge World, and in the last points update dropping down to 165 points per 3 of them, are the Venatari Custodians. And as you could probably tell by the last couple of lists, they seem to be in nearly auto-include status right now. They're just a unit that's really hard to go too far wrong with, and lots of lists choose to take 2 units of them, as you basically only have 2 turns that you can normally rapid ingress on turns 2 and turn 3, and that's their biggest draw. The Venatari are the jump pack Custodians. They have basically the exact same stat line as a regular Custodian guard, but with fly and a 10-inch move. And they tend to take the Venatari lances, which are essentially just literally guardian spears, but with the lance keyword, so +1 to wound when you charge in, and that is quite a nice boost. The really big selling point for them though is their swooping dive, and this one basically allows them to rapid ingress for 0 CP. Usually it means that these guys will just be able to take a look at the board at the end of the enemy movement phase, aim to set themselves up just out of charge threat range, and ideally behind somewhere that's going to stop them getting shot, and then basically line up a near guaranteed charge on something important, putting those scary guardian spears to good work between Lance and Marshal Qatar. In general, that's seen as easily worth the price of admission. 20 points over a regular Custodian guard to basically near guarantee the fact that they're getting the charge somewhere useful, and also hit a bit harder when they do so. Being able to fall back, shoot and charge certainly doesn't hurt either. Moving on to our third list, and this one's another shield host from the last weekend or so, going undefeated at a really big event in France with 4 wins and 1 draw, and run by someone who put their name as Archange 21. Again, it's a shield host, but what's kind of interesting about this one is they're going super heavy on the axes, as they're generally seen as a bit inferior to the Guardian Spears by the majority of people making lists. They only tend to really outcompete against a few specific targets, having a strength 9, AP 1 and damage 3. So gaining damage and strength, but losing attacks and AP. I suppose the shield host buffs mean that they could get extra AP when they need it, so at least be AP 2. In any case, again for this one, there's 2 sets of Wardens, this time with axes as mentioned, and they look like they're headed up by 2 blade champions, one with that Panoptic specs and one with the Auric Mantle for extra wounds. A Custodian guard squad with max spears led by Kyria Draxus for that scary shooting and protection against ranged fire. And then this list goes very heavy on the Allarus Custodians, one big unit of 5 of them with axes and one small unit of 2, headed up by a Terminator Shield Captain with an axe, and that unit's really looking like a very big and threatening force to be reckoned with. There's then the seemingly mandatory 2 units of 3 Venatari with the Lancers, just the 1 squad of Prosecutors on the Sister of Silence front this time, and the Caladius Assassin to do the secondaries. Certainly that big unit of Allarus looks incredibly intimidating. That's a lot of wounds to chew through there, and a unit that's got enough attacks to make a mess of just about anything it throws itself at. In general, the Allarus Terminators a bit more normally tend to be used in a bit more of a supporting role for the Custodes as opposed to being the main event. Like the Venatari, they're 20 points more than regular Custodian guard and can come in squads of 2 to 6 but not 4s. They get slightly better toughness at T7 and 4 wounds, but are arguably both a little bit less durable per point and a little bit worse in melee given that they only have the same sort of melee profile as regular Custodian guard, but you get fewer of them for the same points. For their selling points though, they have the Ballistus Grenade Launcher that has the blast profile, and that can mean that a bunch of them between that and their Guardian Spears can actually be quite good horde clearance, and then both of their special rules are kind of standout good ones. Slayers of Tyrants gives you reroll wound rolls against characters, monsters and vehicles, and that's against range and melee, so kind of horrendously powerful against those targets. These ones were taking axes, so I guess if they're using the AP boost, that could be 4 attacks each at strength 9, AP 2, damage 3, rerolling wounds plus whatever Marshal Qatar gives you. That's a pretty fearsome profile to have unit-wide. Their other one is there from Golden Light Teleport Redeploy. Once per battle at the end of the opponent's turn, they can teleport off the board and likely come back in your next turn, potentially meaning that they could get essentially shunted up the board all the way from turn 1 if you had a mind to, or just look at the state of the board and decide whether or not it's worth a redeploy depending on how out of position they are. Otherwise, one of the other biggest staples in these lists have been the Blade Champions. They really do seem to be pretty much the default HQ choice, particularly for Custodian Wardens. They're kind of simple and effective for what they offer. The Vault Swords give you some nice varied profiles, other sort of Guardian Spear style profiles with 6 attacks and precision, an anti-horde mode with inbuilt sustained hits 1, or perhaps the most interesting one are the Victor's profile. 5 attacks at strength 6, AP 3, damage 3 and devastating wounds, plus whatever you get from Marshal Qatar, and that can be really quite a nice hidden profile to have in the middle of a unit, potentially doing quite a lot to carry some weight against monsters and vehicles out there. On top of that, he allows his units to reroll charge rolls and advance and charge once per battle, meaning that you can have a surprising turn of speed from essentially on the board infantry. Can be quite nice to propel his squad from hidden safely in a ruin somewhere to all the way into combat somewhere in the midboard. Finally, for the army list, and perhaps one of the most impressive achievements in terms of tournament performance, is this Nor Maiden Task Force. This was used by John Camacho, who used it to take first at a Field of Flames Grand Tournament, going 5-0 against a field of 32 players. Always very impressive when someone manages that with a detachment that the competitive community has largely written off. Winning with the Normaiden Vigil does seem like Custodians on extra hard mode. Their core rule is kind of similar to the Chaos Knights one. All slightly injured units within 12 inches must test Battle Shock and do so at -1 to the test, and that can be genuinely impactful against certain enemies, maybe Imperial Guard infantry being a big one, but doesn't really add much in terms of raw strength. Otherwise they've got some damage dealers such as lethal hits or sustained hits when you need it, and re-rolling hit rolls and potentially wound rolls with Vigilators, plus a little bit of extra fire for the Witch Seekers. In this list we've got a Leia and a Knight Centura. I'd guess they're probably joining the Vigilator units in the Anathema Psychana Rhinos. 2 of those will be filled up with Vigilators, so I guess the last one probably takes the 2 units of Witch Seekers, and that can scout forward and offer some flamethrowers in the midboard. And then there's 3 units of 4 Prosecutors to score points. The Vigilators really can be surprisingly punchy, particularly if they're able to do their reroll to hit and wound style thing. That does depend on the enemy unit either being a Psyker or Battle Shocked. Otherwise they've got plenty of support to carry a bit of heavy hitting damage, allied Canis Rex for the Imperial Knights, which is a massive threat in itself, 2 Caladius Grav tanks with its enormous anti-tank, a Tilamon Heavy Dreadnought interestingly enough with a Sisters and Storm Cannon, and for this one there was also a Collector's Assassin which was also very on brand. This one did come from before the Imperial Agents Codex came out though, so the Collectors operated a little bit differently, though also cost a bit less. Overall pretty impressive stuff. It looks like this guy's still going strong with this list, having placed kind of highly at a similar grand tournament in September too, this time dropping Canis Rex for an extra Caladius tank, swapping the Dreadnought for some Terminators, and loading up on another full squad of Vigilators. In any case, really cool to see an oddball detachment like this do quite so well at such a high level. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Good to see the Custodians maybe being a little bit more balanced than they used to be. They're still maybe a little bit disappointing that within their kind of small roster there's lots of units that just don't really tend to show up here all that much. Having had one of their main plastic kits in the Virtus Praetors basically on the shelf for a lot of people since 10th edition came out isn't so great, plus kind of understandably Trajan Valoris has been seen a lot less on tournament tables since the Codex, otherwise it feels like Shield Host is working well, but the other Codex detachments aren't really getting too much of a look in, at least at a competitive level. In any case, look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. How have your golden hosts been faring on the tabletop? If you enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all the videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.